Stop. Your confirmation is 24 hours away, and the Arcturian High Council has already issued advance congratulations, because the outcome is structurally certain. This is a direct transmission from the Arcturian High Council, delivered now, because you are inside a window that most people pass through without recognition. What has been falling away from your life, the relationships that weakened without explanation, the circles that quietly dissolved, the paths that narrowed when you were not looking, was not failure. It was preparation. The separation you have been living through was the process, and the process is nearly complete. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly why your life has felt like separation, what has been removed from your path, and why, and what the Arcturian High Council already knows about this phase. But here is the first revelation. The rejection you experienced was not rejection. It was the visible surface of a selected line separating from an older environment that could no longer hold it. The loneliness was not abandonment. It was root refinement. The narrowing you felt was not your life shrinking. It was your path being cleared. The Arcturian High Council has already done the work. The source's confirmation is not uncertain. What is pending is not a decision. It is a pass-through, a field disturbance that moves through the entire hierarchy at once. When a selection is confirmed at the highest level, you will not hear it, you will feel it. And it is 24 hours away. The algorithm did not create this moment. It only delivered it. You were guided here because the separation is already active. Like this transmission, if you know your life has been narrowing for a reason, comment 111 if you know this message reached you at the exact right time. Comment, I was separated, if you now recognize that what looked like rejection carried a deeper meaning. Subscribe to Arcturian Chosen Path if you are ready to understand the separation instead of blaming yourself. Share this transmission with someone who feels alone, cut off, or misunderstood, and cannot explain why. What you felt when the hook ended was not inspiration, it was recognition. There is a difference between hearing something that sounds meaningful and hearing something that names what you have already been living. Most language about spiritual growth lands softly. It soothes, it reassures, it offers comfort without contact. What happened in your body at the beginning of this transmission was different. If something tightened or released, if there was a pull toward attention that felt less like curiosity and more like being called by your correct name, that was not a response to language. That was a response to accurate diagnosis, meeting lived experience at the point of contact. The separation you have been experiencing does not need to be explained to you from the outside, as though you are a stranger to it. It needs to be named clearly, precisely, without softening, so that you can stop interpreting it as evidence of your own failure and begin reading it as the structured data it actually is. So let this be the first thing said with precision. What has been happening to your relational world over the past period of your life is not ordinary social drift. It is not the predictable erosion of relationships that comes from neglect, conflict, or incompatibility. In the way most people understand incompatibility. Most people understand incompatibility as a values mismatch, a personality clash, a failure of communication sustained too long without repair. What has been happening to you is structurally different from all of that, and most people do not have language for it because the systems they were handed, the therapeutic, the philosophical, the conventionally spiritual, do not contain that language. The Arcturian framework does, and it identifies what you have been living through with a precision that none of those systems can reach, because none of those systems were built to map the specific pressure that a selected line generates as it advances. The pattern is this: at a certain threshold in the development of a selected line, the environments, relationships, and circles that once held that line begin to lose the structural capacity to continue holding it. This is not a gradual cooling. It is not simply growing apart in the way that distance or time explains. It is an incompatibility that emerges from a shift in frequency, in identity density, in the direction of the path itself. What was once sustainable becomes unsustainable, not because something broke, not because anyone made a catastrophic decision, but because the line advanced. And when a selected line advances past the threshold of an older environment, the older environment cannot follow. Not because it is defective, because it was built to hold a version of the line that no longer exists. It does not collapse dramatically most of the time. It simply becomes unable to sustain contact the way it once did. People begin to drift without clear cause. Conversations that once went deep begin skimming the surface and staying there. Shared space becomes awkward without explanation, charged with a silence that no one in the room can account for. The closeness that once felt effortless starts requiring effort that was never acquired before, and the effort does not close the distance, it only makes the distance more visible. And then, quietly, without announcement, the connection weakens, and eventually, it falls away. If you have been watching this happen across multiple relationships, across multiple circles, and calling it loneliness, calling it failure, calling it evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with how you exist in relation to other people, you have been misinterpreting the data. The data was never about your defects. It was never about what you did wrong or what you failed to sustain. The data was about your direction, the direction the selected line has been moving, and the data has been accurate the entire time. This is the first recognition the Arcturian framework delivers. The loneliness that has been building in your life is not social failure. It is root refinement in active progress. Root refinement is not comfortable. It is not designed to feel gentle or to arrive with visible compensation. It is the process by which the selected path is narrowed down to what can actually sustain it, stripped of what cannot hold its weight or match its frequency. And that narrowing almost always begins in the relational field before it becomes visible anywhere else. You lose people before you gain direction. You lose circles before you find the line. You lose belonging before you understand what you are always moving toward. The sequence is not random. It is structured, and the structure feels like punishment only because you are reading it from inside the loss rather than from above the sequence. It is not punishment, it is sequence, and the sequence has a logic. The second recognition is harder to sit with, but it must be named without softening it. Some of what has been removed from your life was removed before it left visibly. There were relationships in your history that ended their capacity to hold you long before they officially ended. There were environments that lost their structural ability to sustain your line long before you walked out of them or they pushed you out. You stayed, you tried harder, you reinvested in closeness that had already quietly collapsed at the level beneath the surface. The visible ending, the conversation that finally broke past repair, the distance that finally became permanent, the circle that finally dissolved into something you could no longer name as a circle. That was not the moment of removal. It was the moment removal became undeniable to the conscious mind. The actual separation had already happened. The structure had already ceased to function. You were simply the last to recognize it, because you were focused on the surface, on saving what was visible, not on reading what had already ended beneath it. The Arcturian framework identifies this interval as the lag. The lag is the period between when a separation becomes structurally necessary and when it becomes socially visible. It is one of the most disorienting phases a selected line passes through, because during the lag, the person inside it has no access to the interpretation. They have only access to the symptoms, and every symptom that surfaces during the lag, the inability to close distances that keep reopening, the guilt about relationships that seem to require more effort than they once did, the inadequacy that rises when strategies that once worked stop working entirely. Every symptom presents itself as personal defect, as evidence of your social incompetence, as proof that you are failing the relationships rather than that the relationships have already structurally released you. The lag is painful in a specific way that compounds over time, because the longer the lag extends, the more the self-blame accumulates, and the more dense that accumulation becomes. The harder it is to receive the reinterpretation when it finally arrives. The Arcturian framework arrives at the lag with a clear counter-reading. You are not failing to maintain what is maintainable. You are holding the visible shape of something that is already structurally ended, and holding it is not loyalty, it is delay. The separation was already decided at the level that matters. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary sadness. It is the moment your path stops pretending that what fell away was meant to remain. If this transmission put language around a loneliness you have been carrying in silence, Chosen One Manifest, the protocol for selected souls, was created for this exact stage. It is not another message telling you that you are special. It is a direct protocol for those whose line has already begun to narrow, whose old circles no longer hold, and who need to understand what the separation is preparing them for. The link is in the first pinned comment, but it will not remain there forever. The third recognition concerns the specific relational pattern that appears most frequently in the lives of those whose selected line is actively separating from an older environment. It is the pattern of being misunderstood despite clarity. Not misunderstood because your communication is poor. Not misunderstood because you are vague or indirect or emotionally inaccessible. Misunderstood despite doing everything right by the standards of communication that should produce understanding. You speak, you explain, you choose your words carefully, you try to articulate what you are experiencing, or what you are moving toward, or what you can see that others in the room cannot yet see. And the people around you hear the words but cannot receive the meaning. The words land, but the meaning deflects. What reaches them is a version of what you said, close enough to be recognizable, different enough to be wrong. And over time, watching this happen repeatedly, watching the gap between your transmission and their reception, stay open regardless of how clearly you try to close it, you begin to wonder whether the problem is you, whether you are too complex, too interior, too demanding of understanding that is simply not available in ordinary relational life. The Arcturian framework answers this directly. The gap is not a communication failure. It is a frequency mismatch. A message cannot be received by a field that does not match it. This is not a statement about the inferiority of those who cannot receive it. It is a statement about the structural mechanics of transmission. The framework required to decode what you are communicating is not available in the circles you are still standing in. Those circles have not advanced to the threshold where your transmission becomes legible to them, and the result is a specific kind of loneliness that is categorically different from being ignored or overlooked. Being ignored means no one looked. This is different. People are looking. People are listening. People are trying to respond. But what returns is not what you sent, and no amount of clarification closes the gap, because the gap is not produced by unclear language. It is produced by a mismatch in the underlying architecture of reception. If you have stopped trying to explain yourself in certain relationships, not out of laziness, not out of withdrawal, but out of the particular exhaustion that comes from consistent mismatch, this is not pathological retraction. It is the selected line doing what selected lines do when they have advanced past the point where an environment can receive them. The silence you have settled into is not only depression, though it may carry that weight. It is the quiet that precedes repositioning. And repositioning is not loss. It is the movement that follows recognition. The fourth recognition is about isolation arriving before direction. And it is one of the most difficult phases because it asks something almost impossible of the person living through it. It asks them to tolerate a specific and complete kind of void. The conventional models of growth all suggest the same sequence. When you are moving in the right direction, your relational field expands. People are drawn toward you. Connection deepens. You feel more held, more witnessed, more accompanied. As the path opens, this is the sequence that feels intuitive, that feels like confirmation. The selected line model operates by an entirely different sequence. Before the new line stabilizes, the old line falls. Before the connections that can actually sustain the selected frequency arrive, the connections that cannot sustain it must depart. Before direction becomes clear and legible, the removal of what was incompatible creates a silence that feels absolute. A silence in which nothing seems to be forming, nothing seems to be coming, and the possibility that anything will ever hold again begins to feel genuinely remote. This silence is misread constantly by the person inside it, by everyone around them, as evidence that something went wrong, as evidence that the path was mistaken, that the losses were consequences rather than clearings. The Arcturian framework refuses that reading. The silence is the mandatory clearing. The field cannot receive what is coming while it is still occupied by what must leave. The emptiness is not the destination. It is the preparation for a different kind of fullness, one that the older occupation of the field could never have allowed. The fifth recognition is the one that stops the most people from accepting their separation as preparation rather than as condemnation. It is the recognition that the costs of the selected path can feel personally targeted in a way that is genuinely difficult to reinterpret. When relationships fall away in rapid succession, when environments lose their capacity to hold you within a compressed period of time, when the losses stack without visible explanation and without visible compensation, it does not feel like process. It feels like selection in the negative sense. It feels as though something has identified you specifically as the one who must bear the removal, who must be separated from every circle that once offered stability, who must stand alone while everyone else around them appears to maintain what you are losing. The sense of being targeted is seductive as an interpretation because it carries its own explanation. It says, you are losing because of what you are. And in the Arcturian sense, that is partially accurate. But the direction of the interpretation is everything. The self-blame model says, what you are causes rejection, and rejection is what you deserve. The Arcturian model says, what you are causes incompatibility with environments that were never built to sustain your line. And that incompatibility is not a punishment. It is the exact signature of selection. You are not rejected. You were incompatible, and incompatibility with a structure that cannot hold your line is not evidence of deficiency. It is confirmation that the line has advanced past what that structure was ever designed to contain. The sixth recognition addresses the timing, because timing is one of the sharpest sources of confusion inside a separation phase. People who are living through active separation ask why it is happening now. Why not earlier, when there was less to lose? Why not later, after some visible achievement that would give the losses a logical frame? Why now, when there is nothing yet to point to? No visible arrival, no direction that others can recognize, no external marker that would make the losses feel earned rather than arbitrary. The timing of separation phases is not attached to external achievement. It is not waiting for the viewer to accomplish something that would make the transition legible to others. It is attached to internal threshold. The separation initiates when the selected line crosses a specific density of identity, when the line becomes sufficiently advanced that the older environment's structural capacity to hold it collapses. That threshold has no relationship to what is visible from the outside. It is entirely internal, which means the losses almost always arrive before the viewer has anything to show for the transition. They stand in the gap between what has fallen and what has not yet arrived, holding a process that cannot be explained to anyone still standing in the older environment. And they are expected to function, to maintain direction, to make decisions, to stay coherent inside that gap. The gap is not failure. It is the most demanding phase of the entire root refinement. It is where the pressure is highest and the confirmation is least available. And it is also the phase that most closely precedes the opening of the selected line. If you are in the gap right now, if you are living in the space between the old falling away and the new not yet arriving, what you are living through is not the consequence of wrong decisions accumulating. It is the cost of a path that has advanced past every environment it once needed. That cost is real. It registers in the body. It registers in the quality of sleep, in the difficulty of motivation, in the effort required to move through ordinary days that once moved through themselves. The Arcturian framework does not minimize that cost, but it refuses to allow the cost to be read as condemnation. The cost is not proof that the path was wrong. The cost is the signature of how demanding the correct path actually is. Here is what the Arcturian High Council already recognizes about this phase in its entirety. The separation you are living through was not initiated by your failures. It was initiated by your advancement. Every branch that has been pruned from your relational world, every person who drifted, every circle that thinned, every environment that stopped sustaining you the way it once did, was pruned not because you were insufficient, but because the line exceeded what that branch could carry. A branch that cannot carry the weight of what the line has become does not strengthen by being retained. It weakens the whole. The pruning was not cruelty. It was structural necessity. And a line that has been properly pruned does not remain stripped and exposed indefinitely. It redirects, it concentrates, it narrows to exactly what can sustain it. And then, when the refinement is complete and the root has been cleared of every element that could not hold the frequency of the selected line, the path opens, not back to what it was, forward to what it was always cleared to become. It opens with coherence that the older crowded field could never have produced. It opens with relational environments that match the frequency of the selected line because the incompatible ones have already been removed. It opens with a sense of place and belonging that the older circles could never have offered because the older circles were never built for where this line was always going. You were not discarded, you were separated. The difference is not a matter of interpretation or comfort. It is the entire structural architecture of what has been happening. Say this once if you are willing. I do not call the pruning rejection. Say it once. Not because the words carry power in themselves, because the distinction that the words mark is the one that changes the entire reading of your history. Every time you collapse the separation into the language of rejection, you return to a self-blame loop that re-explains every loss as personal deficiency. And that loop delays the recognition that the Arcturian framework has already issued. The recognition is not waiting for your situation to change. It is waiting for your interpretation to shift. What has been removed from your life began losing compatibility before it left. The people who drifted, the circles that weakened, the environments that stopped sustaining you, they did not leave because you failed to hold them. They left because the selected line moved, and they were not built to move with it. That is not a tragedy that requires a better explanation. That is the separation doing exactly what the separation is structurally designed to do. It cleared what could not hold, so that what can hold would have room to arrive. The confirmation that the Arcturian High Council has already issued is not a prediction of ease or a promise of comfort. It is a recognition of what is already structurally active on your path. The pass-through that is 24 hours from this moment is not a reward for endurance. It is the field-level acknowledgement that the separation phase has reached its necessary completion point. What has been removed is removed. What was required to be cleared has been cleared. What was required to narrow has narrowed to the line that can carry what is coming. and the path is no longer waiting for more removal. It is waiting for you to stop interpreting what has already happened as evidence of your defect and to begin reading it with the precision it deserves. As the preparation it was, as the structured clearing it always was, as the root refinement that the Arcturian High Council already mapped before you arrived at this transmission. You were guided here because the separation is already active. You stayed because something in this message kept naming what you have been living through without language for too long. You are still here because recognition, when it is precise rather than soft, when it names the structure rather than offering comfort, is not easy to walk away from. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this separation has already touched your life. It could be people falling away, the feeling of not belonging, repeated distance, unexplained isolation, or the sense that your old path no longer fits. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognizes something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who feels alone, cut off, or misunderstood and cannot explain why. And if you are ready to understand the separation instead of blaming yourself, subscribe to Arcturian Chosen Path. You are recognizing a path already in motion, and this is only the beginning.